Hello everyone, welcome to What If Luffy ate Hie Hie no Mi Part 3, Chapter 11. It's been a day since Barady. Now Luffy, Sanji, Yusaku and Jin were on a small boat that was making its way to the Konomi Islands, where Nami had headed. Instead of his suit, which was practically destroyed in his fight with Mihawk, Luffy was dressed in his cardigan with a pair of blue shorts that reached his knees, his sword sheathed at his left hip, his old sandals strapped on his feet, and his straw hat still on his head. Luffy was sitting at a table with a transponder snail in front of him. Time to call Kaya. Luffy thought as he dialed the number of his mini transponder snail. Luffy waited patiently through the puru as he flexed his frozen arm, still trying to get used to it. Clack. Hello. A female voice answered the other side. Kaya. This is Luffy. The Strawhat captain said. Luffyson. So you're alright? Kaya asked in a relieved tone. Well, somewhat. Anyway, where are you right now? Luffy asked curiously. I'm in Nami's house talking with her sister. Kaya answered. Really? Well, make sure that Usopp stays out of trouble. Luffy said, hearing Kaya's breath hitch. Alright Luffyson. Kaya said with an uncomfortable tone. Kaya? Luffy asked suspiciously. What happened to Usopp? He asked. Well. He got how do I say this? Kaya said, stuttering through the sentence. He tried fighting the fishman so I knocked him out. A female's voice called from the other side of the snail in a flat tone. I was gonna tell him. Kaya said in a slightly annoyed tone. He'd get here by the time you did. The woman said in a flat tone. Now wait, where's everyone else? Luffy asked curiously. We got separated when we docked. Zoro got lost and Johnny ran off somewhere. So me and Usopp are in Nami's house right now with Najiko, Nami's sister, and Usopp's unconscious right now. Kaya explained. That sounds complicated, but just hang tight, I'm on my way there, so please do try not to get into any more trouble, understand? Luffy warned. Alright, Luffyson. Kaya said. Luffy hung the snail up and sighed. He always somehow gets into trouble. Luffy thought as he went into the small kitchen on the boat and set the snail on the counter. I just hope everything ends alright. He thought as he left the kitchen and sat down at the table with the others. When Luffy sat down, Yusaku smacked his hand on his knee, garnering everyone's attention. Luffy bro, you need to know what you're getting into, every second we sail, the closer we get to the infamous Arlong. He exclaimed with an accusing finger pointed at Luffy. With a shrug, Luffy just let out an indifferent meh as if it was nothing, which to him it was. There's worse than some coward fishmen hiding away in the East Blue. Luffy hummed silently to himself for a quick moment before looking at Sanji. Hey Sanji, could you go make us some food? Later, I'm actually curious about this Arlong figure. Sanji denied, turning his attention back to Yusaku who looked shocked at Luffy's carelessness on the subject as he began to rant about all of his knowledge on Arlong. As Yusaku ranted about Arlong, Luffy grabbed a sketchpad from somewhere, don't ask. And started sketching one of the mermaids he remembered from his time at Fishman Island. Are you even listening? Yusaku questioned loudly in annoyance, getting confirmations from Sanji and Jin while Luffy kept sketching. Anyway, Arlong was actually in a crew with one of the 7 warlords, Knight of the Sea Jinbei. You've already seen one of the warlords, Dracula Mihawk yesterday, and you've seen how powerful he is. Jinbei is just as or even more powerful as Mihawk. As Yusaku rambled on, Luffy pushed his tongue to his upper lip in concentration as a small bead of sweat dripped from his brow. Arlong has taken control of more than a dozen villages ever since he showed up in East Blue, his strength easily dwarfs that of even Don Krieg. Yusaku said with fear in his voice. Oh, you don't need to worry about that, Luffy could easily handle that Arlong bastard. Sanji said, making Yusaku walk in shock again as Jin nodded in agreement. But I don't understand why my precious Namasan would go after such a dangerous criminal alone. He said thoughtfully. She's probably after his bounty, it is 20 million biri after all. Yusaku said in response. Very soon after, Sanji was daydreaming about Nami being a mermaid with a wide grin on his face. There. Done. Luffy exclaimed, holding his sketchpad in front of him with a triumphant grin on his face. With what? Sanji asked curiously, while Jin and Yusaku looked on questioningly with eyebrows raised. This. Luffy showed them all his sketchpad, which had a black and white drawing of a mermaid with short hair that went as far down as her jaw. She was wearing a crop top that had a star on it with the word crime underneath it, and her tail had one dorsal fin at the base of her spine. The mermaid's mouth was set into a large smile with her eyes closed. Everyone was surprised at the skill of Luffy's artwork, it held enough detail to where it had every single scale on her tail, and how her smile seemed to beam with happiness, making Sanji swoon at how cute the mermaid looked. Oh, are you so good at drawing? Jin asked in surprise, keeping his attention on the drawing. I practiced for a while. Luffy answered simply as he closed his sketchbook. Scene skip. Sanji was in the kitchen preparing a meal for everyone, still in a happy mood from Luffy's drawing of the cute mermaid. What's our plan when we get to where Arlong is? Jin asked curiously. Luffy hummed quietly as he thought to himself. Firstly, we've gotta find Zoro, Johnny, Kaya, Nami, and Usopp. Then we wing it. He said as Sanji walked out of the kitchen with plates of steaming food on top of each, while Yasaku and Jin looked dumbfounded at Luffy's plan. What? It's not like this needs to be done stealthily. Luffy said in defense as the food was set at the table. A few moments later, the waves below the boat started to get slightly more choppy as a low-pitched moo bellowed from the water. It feels like a sea king, pretty small for one though. Luffy thought as he cast a sidelong glance at the ocean. The hell was that? Jin asked quietly with his fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sanji was about to answer when a large creature broke surface and towered above the small boat with a hungry glint in its eyes. It's a sea cow. Yasaku exclaimed in surprise, jumping up from his seat and stumbling back a few steps. The sea cow was giant and around the size of a sea king. It had green spots throughout his body and had horns sticking out from his head with a circular gold ring in its nose. What the hell does it want? Jin asked loudly as he brought out his tonfa. It's hungry. Sanji and Luffy said at the same time. Indeed, the sea cow was staring enviously and hungrily at the tray of food on the table with big, round eyes. Sanji went to the table and grabbed a plate of food and offered it to the giant sea cow. Here you go, eat up. He said kindly while Yasaku looked pleased and slightly awed at Sanji's kindness. The sea cow opened its large maw and was going to eat the offered food when Sanji's leg suddenly shot up and crashed into the creature's jaw, sending it lurching back into the ocean with a crash. What the hell are you thinking, you damn jerk? Yasaku shouted out in anger. It was gonna eat me too. Sanji said with one leg on the edge of the boat, prepared for the cow if it came back. A moment later, the giant sea cow launched back from the surface with a loud bellow of rage and hatred, making Yasaku and Jin stumble back a couple steps. Sanji was going to run up the mast when Luffy stood up from where he stayed in his chair. I'll handle this. Luffy said, suddenly disappearing and reappearing above the raging animal with his fist clenched tightly and a slight scowl on his face. Take this, you overgrown cow. He shouted, his fist crashing down onto the sea cow's skull with tremendous force, sending the cow into brief unconsciousness as it crashed into the ocean with its eyes rolled back into its head. Isaku's jaw dropped in shock and awe at Luffy's strength. He took that thing out with a single hit. Alright, now we can eat in peace. Luffy said with a roll to his head as he sat down at the table with Sanji. These two are insane. Yasaku muttered with Jin agreeing, both with drops of sweat going down the backs of their heads. When they all finished their meals, tied a rope around the cow's horns and ordered it to take them to the island, to which it abided very quickly in fear of getting struck again. They were discussing what to do. Are we going to discuss the plan now that we've eaten? Jin asked curiously. We don't need to. Luffy said dismissively. We're going to go in, kick his ass and leave, preferably with Nami in tow, the ship as well. He explained. Luffy glanced in front of the boat and noticed that the cow decided to start to veer off course towards the shore, and Luffy could see a tall structure in the distance, which he assumed was Arlong Park. Eyes widening, Luffy shot up and shouted at the cow. What the hell do you think you're doing, you idiot? All he got in response was a low moo from the sea cow as it sped up and prepared to ram the coast. What's going on? Sanji shouted as the cow neared land at an alarming rate. It's trying to kill us. Yasaku shouted as he clutched at the side of the boat. It's gone crazy. Jin shouted in a panic. Brace yourselves. Luffy shouted just as the cow rammed into the shoreline, sending the boat soaring into the air high above the island. Sighing, Luffy sat down on a nearby chair and rested his head in his hand. I can add this to the most ridiculous fuck-ups list. He said to himself, mentally filing it away. Now we're falling. Yasaku shouted as the boat began to descend quickly. At this point, Luffy looked slightly exasperated at the current events, and even more as the boat crashed into the forest and started sliding across the ground, crushing and destroying the dozens of trees. Luffy sensed a presence ahead of them and recognized it as Zoro's and paid attention in front of him. When the boat broke through the tree line, he saw Zoro on a path in front of some wetlands. Zoro. Luffy shouted out in warning, instantly getting Zoro's attention, who balked in shock at the rapidly approaching boat. What the? Zoro shouted before the boat crashed into him and continued on its path over the wetlands and crashed into a tall cliff that obliterated the wooden boat and elicited a dust cloud. Looks like we made it. Luffy said as he tried to survey the area around him when the cloud cleared up. What in the fuck? Zoro's grunted out from under a pile of rubble and forced it all off of him. Were you all doing? He shouted out as he glared at Luffy. Flying through the air. Luffy said with a flat tone. Sanji and Jin seemed to be completely unscathed from the crash, while Johnny was in the pile of rubble with his legs sticking up. We're also here to get Nami back, you idiot. Luffy said, glancing around, noticing the absence of his crew. Where are Kaya and Usopp? Luffy questioned with a raised eyebrow. Kaya's still in the village where Nami's sister is apparently, but Usopp was, Zoro said before a voice cut through the conversation. Usopp's dead. They all looked over and saw Johnny, who wore a grim expression on his face. "What?" Zoro exclaimed in shock as Johnny slowly walked towards them. "Big Bro Usopp is already dead, we're too late," Johnny said in a numb tone as he fell to his knees. Johnny bitterly punched the ground as he cried out. "Nami murdered him, in cold blood. Are you serious, bro?" Yusaku cried out in shock. "Yeah, I saw it with my own 2 eyes, she stabbed him and left him to sink to the bottom of the ocean," Johnny shouted resentfully. Luffy was silent as he thought about what Johnny just said before a small smirk crawled onto his lips. "So you're that worried, huh?" Luffy thought to himself. "I believe that you're lying, Johnny," Luffy said simply, causing everyone to look at him with surprised expressions. "Believe what you want, but I know what I saw. Nami killed Big Bro Usopp," Johnny exclaimed with tears streaming down his cheeks. "You really should believe your little friend there, Luffy," a cold voice said from nearby, everyone turning to the source and seeing Nami. "Hey there, Nami," Luffy greeted casually. "What are you doing here?" Nami asked in a bored tone with a cold look in her eyes. "What do you mean, why are you here?" Luffy asked curiously. "We're here because you're our friend, so we're here to help you out," he said simply. "Friends? Heh, you're such a pest," Nami said in a cold tone. "You're all just pathetic enough to deserve each other," she sneered. You killed Big Bro Usopp. I saw you do it," Johnny said with anger in his eyes as he pointed a shaking finger at her. "Then why don't you kill me for revenge?" Nami asked without batting an eyelash. Looking taken aback, Johnny's response was caught in his throat. Strangely, he didn't need to respond, Luffy did. "Nami, you should be careful with what you say, because sometimes," Luffy said before he vanished and reappeared right next to Nami with his sword near her neck, "it might come true," Luffy said with a dangerous tone. Nami was frozen in place with wide eyes and a cold sweat on her brow. Sensing an attack coming in right behind him, Luffy jumped away from Nami as Sanji's foot crashed down where he was. "You're not a real man if you dare to threaten a lady," Sanji said coolly as he puffed out a cloud of smoke before his eye turned to pink heart as he looked at Nami. "Namiswaaan, do you remember me? It's me, Sanji. Your knight in shining armor," the blonde chef shouted in lava mode. "Just shut up, you stupid lava cook, you're only complicating things, dumbus," Zoro shouted as he hit Sanji on the head with his sword still in its sheath. "Who the hell are you calling a dumbus, Marimo?" Sanji retorted as he glared heatedly at the swordsman. Sanji and Zoro got into a heated glare-off when Nami spoke up. "It doesn't matter anyways, whatever your friend there said is true, Usopp is dead and on the ocean floor," Nami said coldly. "You should leave now before Arlong finds you and kills you all. I don't care if you have monster strength, you can't even compare to real monsters, so just leave and never come back, you're all an eyesore." Nami's cold tone had started to deteriorate down to a mournful and miserable tone, though only Luffy seemed to notice. "Farewell," Nami said, in a still cold tone. Luffy stared intently at Nami for a few moments before he closed his eyes and fell back onto the solid ground. "Luffy? Luffy bro?" The men exclaimed in shock and surprise as Luffy simply fell back. "What's wrong? Are you alright?" Yusaku, who had regained consciousness along with Johnny, exclaimed in worry. "Sleepy?" Luffy simply stated as he put his hands behind his head to act as a pillow. "You're gonna sleep right here," Jin exclaimed incredulously. "Don't you understand? I want you out of here. This is none of your business," Nami exclaimed furiously. "I know that, but I'm not interfering, am I? I'm just gonna take a quick power nap," Luffy retorted coolly. "Fine. Just do whatever you want," Nami exclaimed in anger as Luffy heard her storm away in a fit. After that, Luffy just evened his breathing and stayed resting on the ground. He heard some footsteps before he heard someone sit down on the ground. "So what are we going to do now? Just stay here?" he heard Jin ask curiously. "Yep," Zoro's voice said plainly. "Why?" Yusaku asked curiously. "Because our ice brain captain's still here," Zoro answered plainly, gaining silent agreements from Jin and Sanji, albeit grudgingly. "You guys are seriously staying here even with a crazed fishman on the island?" Johnny exclaimed in shock. "We just said that, didn't we?" Zoro asked back. "Well, it looks like you can't be persuaded otherwise, so me and Yusaku will have to leave you guys," Johnny said, starting to walk away, Yusaku in tow. "Alright, then. Take care you two," the swordsman said. "So long bros. We'll see you later." The crew sat there in silence for a few moments, the wind blowing through the trees, rustling the leaves. "Do you really think that Nami killed Longnose?" Jin asked curiously after a few moments of silence. After a moment of thought, Zoro replied. "Nah, she's too immature to do something like that." "Immature?" Sanji said, before his voice immediately rose in volume. "What about Nami's chest is immature?" he shouted in a fury, dashing at Zoro. "Is that all you think about?" Zoro exclaimed in incredulous questioning, bringing his sheathed sword up to block Sanji's furious kick. Unknown to them, Usopp was running towards them with a relieved expression on his face. Hey guys, whack, crack. Sanji and Zoro looked shocked, while Jin looked on with a sweat drop rolling down the side of his head. Usopp had been caught between Zoro and Sanji's furious clash, his face having been crushed between Zoro's sword sheath and Sanji's black shoe. Usopp? Zoro stuttered in surprise. He's alive. Sanji said with a hint of relief in his shocked tone. Nope, I think he's dead now. Jin said in a deadpan tone. Pulling back their respective weapons, Zoro and Sanji let Usopp drop to the ground where he lay, as if he was actually dead. What the hell happened to you? Luffy exclaimed in surprise, having stood up from his spot on the ground before he glanced at Zoro and Sanji's faces and placed his face in his hand. You're both idiots. Luffy said whilst shaking his head. The blonde did it. Zoro said with a scowl on his face. Luffy kneeled down near Usopp's level and asked with a slightly worried tone, Usopp, you alright? Ah, yeah, we're here, Luffy. The longnose said with a distant voice that sounded like he was almost dead. I'm here too, hello. Sanji said with an almost uncomfortable tone. In an instant, Usopp was standing and glaring at Sanji with an inferno of annoyance burning in his eyes. I'm gonna kill you one day. Usopp exclaimed with anger. Ooh. Full recovery. Sanji exclaimed, sounding quite impressed with Usopp's seemingly impossible healing skill as he put a hand on Usopp's shoulder, which was immediately slapped off. Anyway, Luffy said, standing from his crouch. We heard from Johnny that Nami killed you. So what really happened? Luffy asked curiously, looking at Usopp. Blinking in realization, Usopp gained a serious look on his face. There's something going on with Nami and she's not telling us something. Even though I'm here, Johnny technically wasn't wrong, I'm guessing that it did look like Nami had killed me. Usopp then went on to explain how Nami had faked his death by stabbing her hand and letting him escape through the ocean. So it seems that there's a lot more than meets the eye. Jin said thoughtfully. Either way, it's no use. A voice exclaimed from nearby, making the men turn to look at the source curiously. The woman who spoke was a lavender-haired woman wearing pink lip gloss, a button-up shirt with green and yellow stripes, a large tattoo stretch from her right arm across her chest, a blue pair of jeans that reach her calves and a pair of sandals. Next to her was Kaya, who seemed to have come with her from her house. Nichiko? Kaya? Usopp exclaimed in surprise. Oh, you must be Nami's sister, then. Luffy said, looking at Nichiko. Nami's older sister? No wonder she's so beautiful. Sanji exclaimed, his eye a pulsing heart. Anyway, what do you mean by it's no use, Nichiko? Luffy asked with a raised eyebrow. I mean that no matter what you do, Arlong's rule will never end. Nichiko said in a final tone. And please leave Nami alone, I'll explain her whole situation to get you off her back. She explained. Blinking, Usopp asked curiously. You mean that you're going to tell us why Nami is with such a messed up crew? Yeah, and if that doesn't get you off of this island, then I have absolutely no idea what will. Meh, I'll pass. Luffy said dismissively, walking past Nichiko with an indifferent stride. I really don't give a rat's ass about her past, even if I knew what it was, nothing would change. Luffy said. Where are you going? Jin asked curiously. For a walk. Luffy said simply as he continued to walk. After a minute or two, Luffy started to reminisce about the past, smiling every once in a while. Can't wait until I get to see Shanks again, I really miss him. Ace and Sabo too. Luffy thought. Hey. What are you doing out here? Being snapped out of his thoughts, Luffy looked at the source of the interruption and saw two fishmen, one was an octopus and the other was a ray, the octopus being the one that spoke. Out for a walk. Luffy said dismissively, walking past the two fishmen. Where are you heading? The octopus asked curiously. Why should you care? Luffy asked curiously. Ah well, the octofishman stuttered, trying to find the right words to say. It's just that we don't get many visitors around here. He said before his 6 arms each had a cloth in their hands and started waving them in a farewell. Well, have a pleasant walk, sir. He exclaimed. Hey, smartus. Where do you think you're going? The ray asked with annoyance in his voice. Like hell I know. Luffy said casually, continuing to walk away. Scene skip. Luffy had arrived at the village a short time later and saw that a squad of marines led by a man whose face had some resemblance to a rat and a heavily scarred man dressed in a police uniform with short sleeves and pants with a pinwheel in his hat. The hell are the marines doing here? Luffy muttered to himself, his eyes following the marine. Something isn't right. Luffy said, seeing a smugness in the marine's eyes that he's seen before. Sadly, it's not my business. Luffy said to himself as he walked over to a tree and sat down at the base of it, closing his eyes and then drifting off to sleep. Time skip. Nichiko, are you alright? Many worried shouts that were coming from a large group in front of him woke Luffy from his short nap. Slowly standing up, Luffy walked over to the crowd and managed to see what was happening and saw Nichiko on her back with a bullet wound in her stomach and who Luffy assumed was a doctor kneeling over her, trying to help her. Scanning his eyes over the small crowd around him, Luffy spotted Nami at her sister's feet looking hopeless, furious, and completely lost on what to do at the same time. Walking over to her and kneeling behind her, Luffy tapped her shoulder and asked her curiously, "Do you mind telling me what happened?" Nami snapped her head around and glared at Luffy with unbridled rage. She launched her arms forward and gripped at Luffy's cardigan, dragging him up to his feet as she stood up as well. "Why are you still here? Just stay out of my business and leave the island." Nami shouted, dropping Luffy on the ground and sprinting towards Arlong Park with fury burning in her eyes. "About another 5 minutes or so," Luffy said to himself, standing up and walking back over to the tree he was resting at and leaned against it again. "She's becoming a handful, though," he said before he smirked. "Good thing I find handfuls amusing." Really short time skip. Luffy was still resting against a tree when he sensed his crew just outside the village and saw the villagers formed in what looked like sloppy military lines, with a heavily scarred in front with his sword in his hand. "Today is the last day that we deal with Arlong's treachery," the man shouted as he held his sword high. "We will storm Arlong Park and kill as many as we can for what they did to Nami. Are you with me?" This was answered by an uproar of battle cries and everyone hoisting their weapons high with determination and confidence. Everyone. The villagers and Luffy looked up and saw that Nami was walking into the village with a fake smile on her face. "I can get all of the money back. This time it'll be easier, I could do it in 3 years, tops," she exclaimed with false hopefulness in her voice as she walked up to the villagers and stopping a little in front of them. "Nami," Genzo said as he walked forward and stopped a few meters in front of her. "You don't have to suffer anymore, we'll take care of it from here," he said in a comforting tone. "I can't let you do that, Genzo," Nami suddenly exclaimed as she pulled out a knife. "If you go against Arlong, you'll all die," she shouted desperately in warning. Walking right in front of Nami, Genzo gripped Nami's knife in a firm grip until he drew blood. "We know that, Nami. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we won't give those damned fishmen help before we fall," the doctor exclaimed with confidence booming in his voice. "Yeah, now then, everyone," Genzo started raising his sword to the sky once more, "let's give them hell." The villagers responded with loud thunderous battle cries as they raised their weapons in unison, following Genzo's order without a shred of fear present. After everyone had charged past Nami, she collapsed to her knees, the knife clattering uselessly on the ground. Nami's eyes were wide and filled with hopelessness and sadness that was soon replaced with fury and rage as she turned her furious glare to the tattoo on her left arm as she gripped at it with hateful tears pouring from her eyes and her lips parted in a ferocious snarl. Nami grabbed the knife and brought down onto the tattoo on her arm. "Arlong," she exclaimed with fury and hate as she repeatedly brought the knife onto the tattoo, either not noticing the pain or too pissed to care. "Arlong. Arlong." With each anger-filled shout, she brought the knife down, further bloodying her arm. Her furious stabbing was stopped when her arm was gripped by a strangely cold but familiar hand. Nami looked up and saw Luffy standing over her with a blank stare aimed right at her. Her hand loosened and she dropped the knife, covering her mouth to not let any broken sobs out. "What are you still doing here?" Nami asked, now sounding annoyed and frustrated. "I told you to leave, didn't I?" Nami asked again, louder this time. "Yep, you sure did," Luffy replied in a flat tone. Nami's hand curled into a tight fist as she clutched at the dust and threw it behind her, hitting Luffy with it. "Then why are you still here? This has nothing to do with you," Nami screamed as she continued flinging dust back at Luffy. "You don't even know what's happening here," Nami continued to shout. "Nope, not a damn thing," Luffy said dismissively. Nami continued to throw dust back at Luffy, venting years of sadness and anger, before she finally stopped, silent sobs racking her body. Turning her head back to Luffy, tears pouring out of her eyes, Nami pleaded in a broken tone. "Luffy, please help me." "You know," Luffy said with a smirk as he reached up to his hat, then placing it firmly on Nami's head, "you could have just asked," he said as he took his hand off of her head and walked away, towards Arlong Park with a serious expression on his face. At the edge of town, Zoro, Sanji, Jin, Usopp and Kayu were standing, waiting for orders from Luffy. "Aya, treat Nami's wounds." The nurse nodded in approval, already walking to Nami, ready to treat her wounds. "The rest of you, with me. We're going to bring hell to Arlong Park," Luffy said seriously, not stopping. "Yeah." The four exclaimed with serious expressions on their faces, looking ready for anything. Scene skip. Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, Jin and Usopp were walking towards Arlong Park, with determination shining in their eyes. As the gates to Arlong Park came into view, the group of villagers that charged earlier were there with Johnny and Yasaku, who seemed to be guarding the gates, were in front of them. Johnny and Yasaku suddenly stood up and pointed in the direction of the 5 men with wide, relieved grins on their faces. "There. That's them," Johnny said with happiness in his voice. "Show 'em hell, bros. If no mercy." As they approached the mob of villagers, who parted to make a path for them, Luffy clenched his fist tightly, imbuing it with HAKI, making it dark black. I don't intend to. Luffy said with a serious tone. When he stopped at the gate, Luffy brought his arm back and threw it forward at a blinding speed, his fist blurring with strength and speed, then crashing into the thick stone gate, knocking it off of its hinges in a single blow, kicking up a large dust cloud, and sending it across the entire plaza. Walking into the plaza through the dust cloud, Luffy set his serious gaze onto a shark-looking fishman that was sitting in a throne-like chair and started walking towards him. I assume that you're Arlong. Luffy said in a firm tone. The shark fishman glared at Luffy, watching his every move. Yes, I am Arlong. He said, his glare intensifying on Luffy. And who are you? Arlong asked with a dark tone. I'm Luffy, Luffy said. And what are you? Pirate. Two fishmen tried to stop Luffy's advance, but were promptly knocked out by quick punches to the gut that were basically effortless. And what would a pirate want with me? Arlong asked with anger now present in his voice. Wordlessly, Luffy dashed ahead at blinding speeds and threw his fist into Arlong's jaw, launching him out of his chair and making him crash through the stone wall and slid along the earth before he crashed into a tree that was more than 15 meters away from the wall. Luffy looked up in Arlong's direction with a furious glare in his eyes. That's for harming my crewmate. He shouted with anger clearly present in his voice. Arlongson. You damn human. Let's get him. Instantly, dozens of fishmen went to attack Luffy, who only stood calmly, not moving a single inch. Jumping in, Sanji kicked away all of the fishmen that were moving to attack Luffy in a few short moments with little problems. Don't just go hogging all the prey, idiot. Sanji said with a light-hearted tone as he landed on his feet. Speak for yourself, Dumbus. Jin retorted, spinning his tonfa in slow circles. Don't mind if you guys take all of the prey, I'll just cover your backs. Usopp said, stuttering in fear. You seem raring to go as always, Usopp. Zoro said, rolling his eyes as he stepped up. Nayu, it's you. You tricked me before. Hachi exclaimed, pointing his finger at Zoro with an angry expression on his face. I didn't even say much. Zoro said with a sweat drop on his head as he remembered the events that occurred between him and Hachi. Hachi then randomly screamed in fear as his eyes fell on Usopp. That long-nosed guy's alive. This caused the ray fishman to snarl in anger with resentment in his eyes. That means that Nami betrayed us. He said with an enraged tone as he glared at Usopp. The pirate, huh? Arlong asked rhetorically with anger in his voice. I guess it makes sense now, you were after Nami this whole time, Arlong said, bursting out with boisterous laughter. Too bad for you, that girl's mine, and I'm not giving her up. Arlong exclaimed with more laughter. Laughing as well, Hachi stepped up confidently. You idiots aren't even worth Arlong's time. We know how to deal with you. Hachi exclaimed as he then blew through his long mouth like a trumpet. What's he doing? Luffy asked to himself. After a few moments of silence, a large recognizable sea cow broke the surface and towered over everybody with a large, swollen lump on his head. Hachi greeted to the sea cow, causing it to lean down to see what Hachi wanted before it stopped dead in fear as sweat poured down its body. Oh, it's that sea cow. Luffy said flatly. It looks like he's a pet to these fishmen. Sanji said as he nodded in agreement. The cow began to weep and moo silently to itself as he turned around and started to swim away, causing Hachi to yell after him. Mamu, where do you think you're going? Arlong asked threateningly, causing Mamu to stop dead once more. You can continue to leave, but know that I will find you. He said with a sharp grin. After a moment of silent deliberation, Mamu turned around and started to attack. Too bad for the cow, Luffy was ready. Throwing his hand out, Luffy stopped Mamu with one hand on his nose. Now why don't you just leave? Luffy asked the cow before he let out a pulse of Hashoku Haki, causing its eyes to widen in fear with sweat pouring down its body before it hurriedly swam away, not stopping for anything. It also seems that Luffy's Haki was too much for the smell-free fishmen, causing them to foam at the mouth and pass out with their eyes rolled back into their heads. Arlong, I didn't come here to deal with your underlings or pets, I came here to teach your arrogant ass a lesson. Luffy said with a serious tone, turning and pointing at the sharkfishman challengingly, so stop hiding behind your men and face me like a man, you coward. Luffy exclaimed, causing the villagers to balk and pale in shock. I can't believe he has that much strength. The doctor exclaimed from the crowd, causing the rest of the villagers to cheer Luffy and the others on. Snapping out of his stupor, Hachi began shouting insults at the five men. You damn humans, how dare you hurt our brothers? He shouted, flailing his arms like crazy. Arlongson, let us take care of this trash for you. A longmouth fishman said. Yeah, Arlongson, let us kill these weaklings for you. The ray fishman said confidently. Achi, Chu, Karubi, they're all yours. Arlong said agreeably. I know just the way to cook octopus. Sanji said confidently, while Zoro and Jin smirked. Without another warning, Hachi shot out a jet of black ink aimed directly at the five men, four of whom ran out of the way whilst Luffy just calmly held up his hand. Ice Age. he said calmly, a wave of sub-zero air shooting out from him, freezing the pools of water in Arlong Park in the ink, with small cracks across it. After a moment of silence, the frozen ink shattered into black crystalline shards of ice. Boring. Luffy said with a bored tone and a sigh. The fishmen all looked shocked and outraged at the same time. You damn human, Karubi said with anger in his eyes before he jumped at Luffy with a fist raised, don't get so cocky. He shouted as he threw his fist at Luffy, only to have it kicked out of the way and two tonfa crashing into his chest, sending him back into the ground. If you want to fight, we'll gladly take you on. Sanji said as he tapped his shoes on the ground, Jin standing next to him with a smirk on his face. Fine then, I'll show the might of fishman karate. Karubi said as he dropped to a karate stance. Jin and Sanji both dropped into their own fighting stances as they prepared to fight Karubi. I'll kill you, you damn human. Hachi shouted as he drew 6 swords and charged at Luffy with anger in his eyes. Seeing Hachi charge at Luffy, Zoro stepped in and blocked Hachi's 6 swords with his 2 swords in his hands. If you're a swordsman, then I'll gladly take you on. Zoro said with a smirk as Hachi jumped back. I am 6's word style Hachi. The second best swordsman from Fishman Island. I'll kill you for making a fool out of me. Hachi exclaimed with a determined expression. Phew, seems the others are bothered, I don't need them to take out this measly human. Chu said as he went to attack Luffy but was hit in the face by a lead pachinko. Hey, you damn fishman, if you want to take anyone on, you should take me on. The great Captain Usopp. The long-nosed sniper shouted from the gate of Arlong Park. Chu looked to be greatly annoyed by Usopp and ran at Usopp, causing the boy to run away. As Chu ran through the crowd, noticed that all of the villagers had weapons. It seems to look like you all were trying to start a reb. Chu's accusation was cut short by a pachinko exploding on his face. Hey. Don't you dare take your eyes off of me, fishman. Usopp shouted with a false determined expression as his legs shook. I'll kill you, you damn human. Chu shouted as he ran at Usopp. In Arlong Park, the other fights were all happening at once, while Luffy and Arlong stood still. Seems like we're the only ones not fighting. Luffy stated. Yeah, why don't you start, I'll be going all out, so it'd be boring if I ended it that soon. Arlong said confidently. Too bad for you, I'm not holding back either. Luffy said as he disappeared and reappeared with his leg crashing into Arlong's side, launching the shark fishman through his own base, making him cough out saliva and a bit of blood as he nearly lost consciousness. No mercy. Luffy coldly stated as he walked through the many collapsed walls to where Arlong was, but stopped momentarily to grab a large saw blade with 6 blades on it. This must be his. Luffy thought to himself, dragging the blade with him. After walking through a few more destroyed walls, Luffy came upon the side of Arlong Fasup in the rubble, trying to catch his breath. Good, you're still awake, it'd be a shame for you if you lost this easily. Luffy said in a disinterested tone, dropping the large saw blade near Arlong. I suppose this is yours. If you're gonna fight all out, you'll need it. Luffy said, placing his hands in his pockets. You damn insolent human. Arlong growled out as he grabbed his saw blade and started swinging wildly at Luffy. You know nothing of the insurmountable strength of the fishman race. I'll destroy you. Arlong shouted in rage as Luffy dodged his strikes easily. After a few more moments of dodging effortlessly, Luffy caught the saw blade with a blackened hand. You know, being an old comrade of Jinbei's, I thought you'd be a lot stronger than this. Luffy said in a bored tone with a tinge of disappointment as he snapped the saw blade in half, leaving only 3 of the blades left. You broke the Kiribachi, Arlong exclaimed in surprise as his eyes suddenly changed and he went berserk. You human trash. You think you can match the strength of a fishman, you think you Arlong's almost hysterical rant was stopped by Luffy's fist uppercutting him through the multiple floors of Arlong Park, stopping at the top floor. The strength of fishman this, the strength of fishman that. Luffy said as he jumped from floor to floor up to the top. You really are a noisy son of a bitch. He finished as he landed on the top floor and stopped to look at the 8-foot-tall stacks of paper and shelves and bookcases with a desk in the corner. Noticing a pen on the desk, Luffy walked over and picked it up, studying it with a critical eye, noticing bloodstains all over it. There's blood on this pen. He thought to himself as he lightly rolled it in between his fingers. So you've noticed. This is Nami's room, she has been drawing her sea carts here for 8 years, this room is her happiness. Arlong said arrogantly from behind Luffy as he took out his broken pair of teeth and regrew another pair in seconds. Then this must be Nami's blood. Luffy thought with grim realization as he stopped rolling the pen, slowly placing the pen on the desk. Her talent of navigation is beyond any that I've seen, and her sea carts are all phenomenal. Arlong exclaimed with a large grin. Could you ever think of a better way to use her like I do? Use? Luffy questioned quietly with his expression shadowed by his bangs. Yes, use. Arlong said with his still arrogant grin on his face. Her talents would be useless on your worthless ship. I'm the only one who truly knows how to use a woman like her. Arlong exclaimed. Luffy stood silently for a moment before he brought his head up and glared directly at Arlong, shocking him in place. Luffy had never felt this much rage and fury ever in his life, not when he was a child, not when Kuro treated his crew like pawns, not even when Buggy ruined his hat. This rage he felt reached to sky-shattering levels, and it was all aimed at Arlong. With an immense amount of bestial anger in his voice, almost feral, Luffy growled out. "What the hell do you take her for, you filthy, lying piece of shit?" In an instant, Luffy kicked the desk through the wall, shocking Arlong even more. "What are you doing?" Arlong exclaimed. Dashing around the room, Luffy destroyed the contents of the room, kicking out shelves and stacks of maps and explosions of debris and dust. "My sea charts. My 8 years' worth of sea charts." Arlong shouted out before he rounded on Luffy and swung what was left of his blade at Luffy, who dodged and made Arlong slice his own sea charts. "No." After a minute, Luffy had finished destroying the room and stopped in the middle of the room as Arlong glared hard at him. "You damn human. You think you've won? I'll kill you painfully." Arlong exclaimed as he opened his jaw wide and started spinning like a drill. "Shark on tooth." Arlong shouted as he rocketed forward at Luffy. "This room is Nami's prison," Luffy said as he glared hard at the advancing Arlong. "I'll destroy this place until nothing but rubble is in its place," he exclaimed as he kicked up, catching Arlong in the jaw and rocketing him up into the sky. Dashing up after him, Luffy appeared above Arlong with his hands black with HAKI and locked together by his fingers. He couldn't help but notice how Arlong's nose was bent upwards at a right angle. "Fall," Luffy said before he crashed his interlocked hands down onto Arlong's skull, making him rocket straight through Arlong Park until he crashed into the earth, cratering it with a great tremor. Up above Arlong Park, Luffy drew his sword and held it above his head with both hands. "Itoryu. Hikamakiri," Luffy shouted as he sliced the air in front of him as if there was an enemy in front of him. After a few moments of silence, Arlong Park was sliced down the middle, the attack having completely decimated everything in its path with Arlong at the end, his body having been sliced cleanly in half by Luffy's attack. The building, having been destroyed inside and out, began to quake and rumble with instability, causing the spectators to shout in worry and panic. "The building's gonna crash. Nami, we gotta get out of here." The doctor shouted as he grabbed Nami by the arm and tried to lead her away, but she stayed in her spot, not letting her wide, shocked eyes leave the instable building. The building crashed down to the ground, eliciting a large dust cloud and causing a tremor to travel across the cement and crack the ground. Letting himself fall from the sky, Luffy landed on the rubble pile and looked directly at Nami. "Nami," Luffy shouted out. "You are part of my crew." Nami stood shocked until tears of happiness began to pool in her eyes and trail down her cheeks. She hummed in agreement with emotion, hitching her breath. "Tell this to the rest of the island," Luffy shouted, catching everyone's attention. "This island is now under the protection of Monkey D. Hilky Luffy," he shouted, causing the villagers to shout with happiness and rapture. "Arlong is gone. His reign is over," one of the villagers shouted. "Now just hold on a moment," a voice exclaimed from behind the crowd of villagers. Everyone turned and saw the rat-faced marine. "We're here to take the pirates and Miss Nami into custody for crimes of theft and piracy," he said with a smug smirk, causing everyone's expressions to darken. "Now ain't that just a mood killer?" Luffy asked with a light-hearted tone after a moment, walking down from the rubble as he drew his sword. A pirate standing against me?" the marine asked rhetorically in an arrogant tone. "Yep, though, I feel that the term standing against signifies that both people mentioned are at the same level of strength. So I'd say that I'm not standing against you, I'd say that I'm completely annihilating you and making you kneel before me," Luffy said with a demonic grin as he walked towards the marine squad in front of him. Some of the soldiers stepped back with sweat pouring down their bodies in fear. "Men, arrest this man immediately," Nezumi shouted out. "Funny, the rat-faced marine is cowardly, just like his namesake," Luffy said with a smirk as cold air and an intimidating aura began pouring out from him. "Itoryu," he said as he began to quicken his pace. The marines were frozen in place with wide, terrified eyes and gasps of fear leaving their mouths. Luffy then vanished and reappeared behind the marines with his sword held in front of him and a slight breeze passing by the soldiers. "Aim soon." All of the soldiers behind Nezumi all collapsed with blood spraying from open wounds created by Luffy's rapid slashes. Turning around with wide eyes, Nezumi looked near madness. "You pirate scum, the higher-ups will know about this and you won't be able to survive, you hear me?" he shouted as he turned and ran over the ice and swam out onto the ocean, towards his ship. "What a coward," Luffy muttered, sheathing his sword and began walking back to Arlong Park when he felt a sudden pain in his chest. "GKH. The hell?" he muttered before he felt blood begin to pour from his wound from his fight with Mihawk. "Oops, open the stitches," Luffy said as he tried to freeze it over, only for it to not work. "Is it because the cut was made with HAKI?" Luffy thought curiously as he stood up and walked back to his crew. "Luffy? What happened?" Nami asked in shock as she hurried over to him, causing everyone to look at him. Nothing. Luffy said carelessly. You tore your stitches, didn't you? Kaya asked suspiciously. It's nothing to worry about, Luffy said before he looked at his wound, I think. You need to get this treated. Kaya exclaimed, grabbing him by the shoulders. You're so careless. Geez Luffy, you need to quit making our ladies worried. Sanji said with a smirk. You're so annoying Swirlabro. Zoro muttered in annoyance as he rested against the rubble. The hell did you just say to me? Sanji asked dangerously as he glared at Zoro, causing sparks of anger to shoot between the two. Those two will never get along. Jin muttered to himself with a drop of sweat trailing down his head as he sighed in resignation. Yeah. Usopp said from next to him. They're insane. Nami looked over the small pirate crew before she smiled and took off Luffy's hat as she walked over behind Luffy and placed a straw hat on his head. Looking back at Nami, Luffy simply smiled at her and laughed his shishishi laugh. Time skip. Luffy was laying down on a bed in the doctor's house, his frozen arm dissipated for now, as he focused on keeping his Loja defenses down, cringing in pain as the small suture needle pierced his skin and was slowly pulled through with a thin string attached to it as it was caught on skin and slightly pulled on the flesh. You idiot. Did you think that a wound this large would heal on its own? Why would you even think about fighting with this? The doctor exclaimed as Luffy stayed silent and Kaya was by the doctor's side, giving him cotton swabs and rubbing alcohol every now and then. To be honest, I forgot about it. Luffy said quietly. How? And who even caused this? The doctor said with annoyance present in his voice. No one you need to worry about right now. Luffy said as he sensed someone walk into the room. Hey Luffy, I've been wondering. Zoro's gruff voice called out with a curiosity. Luffy hummed curiously. Are we gonna start training soon? Zoro asked in mask anticipation. Yeah, we'll start as soon as we leave. Luffy said in a short answer, trying to keep his fruit defenses down. Alright. Just wanted to know. Zoro said in acceptance after a moment as the doctor finished up Luffy's stitches. Alright kid, you're good to go, just don't tear him, alright. The doctor said leaving a warning as he saw Luffy sit up and refreeze his prosthetic. Where would Nami be right now? Luffy asked curiously as he stood up with some help from Kaya. If anywhere, I think she'd either be on the cliff face not far from here, or her house. The doctor said as he waved his hand in a general direction. Thanks. Luffy said as he managed to leave the building without Kaya's help. When he left the building, Luffy saw the whole village partying with a large bonfire nearby. The perfect way to celebrate. Luffy thought with a smirk before walking off towards where he felt Nami's presence. A minute or so later, Luffy walked into a clearing that led from the forest and had two people at what seemed like a grave on the end of a cliff. Getting closer to the figures, Luffy noticed that the two people were Negico and Genzo, and they looked solemn, and Negico looked to be almost near tears. Silently, Genzo held up an alcohol bottle and slowly poured the contents on the ground in a respectful manner. As if he was sensed, Negico turned and spotted him. Blinking, she fully turned to him. What are you doing here? She asked curiously. Actually, I was just on my way to speak with Nami. Luffy explained, catching a glimpse of the grave. Excuse me for asking, but whose grave is that? Luffy asked with a quiet but curious tone. After a moment of silence, Genzo answered with a quiet tone. It belongs to Nami and Negico's mother, Bellamere. Ah, I see. You have my deepest condolences. Luffy said with a bow to his head. Thank you, Genzo said, still not turning from the grave. Listen, boy. I know that Nami's going to go with you and that I won't be able to stop her. Genzo said. So know this, his tone gained a seriousness within. If any of you ever hurt Nami, I'll kill you. Genzo said. We won't hurt her. Luffy said with firmness in his voice. Genzo rounded on his heel and shouted out, are you sure? Negico jumped at the volume of his voice. Absolutely, sir. Luffy said with a nod, glancing at Negico, he noticed that she seemed to be worried about something. What's wrong Negico? He asked curiously. She slightly jumped at the question. Well, I was wondering if I could come along with you as well. She said with an uneasy look on her face. Eh? Genzo looked absolutely shocked at Negico's request. Why? Luffy asked with a quirked brow. Well, I guess it's just my protectiveness over Nami, but I guess I'm just kind of interested what the rest of the world is like. Negico said with a shrug. Why is she so carefree about this? Luffy thought curiously. Well, what could you bring to the crew? Luffy asked. Tilting her head to the side, Negico hummed quietly. Well, I could keep Nami in check because I know how she can be, especially if she comes into money. Negico explained with a slightly joking tone at the end. In response, she only received silence from the dark-haired captain, causing her to slightly panic. If you want me to be able to fight, I'll learn, you won't have to worry. Just let me join. Negico said pleadingly. Alright. Luffy said, causing Negico's face to brighten up. I'll let you join the crew, plus, I'll train you personally with Zoro, my first mate. Luffy said, causing the lavender-haired woman to smile brightly. Running at Luffy, she jumped and gave Luffy a giant hug, startling the man for a brief moment. "Thanks a bunch, Luffy," she exclaimed in glee. "It's nothing," Luffy said, patting Nejico on the back before noticing that Genzo was stock still with a depressed feel about him and a shocked expression on his face. Is he gonna be alright? Letting go of Luffy and looking at Genzo, Nejico raised a brow. "I think so, he's probably just shocked. I guess. Anyway, we should head back, I still want to get some alcohol," Luffy said, walking back out of the clearing towards the village. "Alright, Captain," Nejico said with a light-hearted tone, following after him. The two left Genzo, who was still shell-shocked by the way, alone in the clearing as he tried to compute what transpired. 3 days later, over the course of 3 days, the whole village partied until they fainted from exhaustion or drunkenness. It was the very early morning as the rising sun greeted many unconscious with blinding rays of the early sunlight, only one figure standing on the deck of the pirate ship, the Going Merry. This figure was Luffy. He was holding a mug of black coffee in his right hand as his artificial hand slowly stirred it in a circle, creating a small whirlpool of the dark liquid as he looked at the village the ship was docked at. He was wearing a pair of pajama pants with a plain black tee with his hat hanging off of his neck. Bringing the coffee mug up to his lips, Luffy drank a sip of the bitter but tasteful liquid, lightly smacking his lips as he swallowed the drink. Quietly clearing his throat, Luffy spoke to seemingly no one without turning around. "Mornin' Zoro." "Mornin'." The gruff voice of Luffy's first mate sounded out as he walked towards his captain and leaned on the railing next to him. There was a few moments of silence that was interrupted by Luffy sipping on his coffee. So, Luffy started, placing his mug on the railing and turning to Zoro, leaning his left arm on the railing as well. "What'd you need?" he asked curiously. "When are we leaving?" Zoro asked in response. "When everyone is up and alert," Luffy responded, causing Zoro to give him a curious glance. "I'd like to have a fully functioning crew," Luffy said with a shrug. "Even if this stretch of water isn't even close to the Grand Line in terms of danger, the crew still has to be vigilant." "That's so?" Zoro said. "Hey, Luffy," Luffy hummed in acknowledgement, "wanna have a quick spar?" This caused Luffy to raise an eyebrow in curiosity. "You sure?" Luffy asked. Nodding in response, Zoro fully turned to his captain. "I know that I don't match up to Mihawk, but I want to know where I stand compared to you," Zoro said. After studying Zoro for a moment, Luffy sighed. "Alright, if that's what you want," Luffy said as he picked up his mug again. "Lem finish my coffee first though, then we can start," he said as he downed his coffee. "Alright, now we can start," Luffy said as he placed his mug on the railing and freezing a sword in either hand. Turning to Zoro, Luffy saw that he already had his 3 swords out and his bandana tied around his head with a wide smirk on his face. "Whenever you're ready, Zoro," Luffy said. As soon as Luffy finished his sentence, Zoro charged at Luffy with an immense amount of speed. "Santoryu," Zoro said as he crossed his arms, his swords pointing at the sky. "Oni," he charged straight ahead, slicing forward with his swords in a blur, all 3 meeting at one point. "Guy." Zoro stopped cold in the middle of his attack, the reason being Luffy. His captain was holding all 3 of his swords at bay with one of his ice swords and what looked like minimal effort. Zoro's eyes widened in shock seeing his attack blocked so easily and effortlessly. Moving his sword, Luffy let Zoro stumble past him and chopped him in the back of the neck with a grand amount of force, nearly rendering the green-haired swordsman unconscious and making him fall to the deck. As Zoro panted and tried to stand with great effort, Luffy simply stood in his spot. "You done yet?" Luffy questioned curiously, turning to the barely conscious Zoro who was still struggling to stand from his position. "Not yet." Zoro ground out as he finally managed to get on his feet and turned to look at Luffy with a determined expression. "Alright then," Luffy said, readying his swords, "come at me." Crossing his 3 swords, Zoro put as much HAKI as he could into his blades. "Santoryu," he said as he prepared to charge. Torga as he was about to finish his attack, Luffy charged forward and pierced his sword just above Zoro's heart, causing Zoro to cough out some blood. After a moment, Luffy raised a brow. "You're not stepping back, why? Are you afraid of feeling defeat?" he asked curiously. "Of course I am, if I step back, then I'm giving up on my dream. If I want to be the world's greatest, I'll need to surpass you, and if I give up now, I'll never be even close to getting that goal, so I won't step back," Zoro said with determination in his eyes, causing Luffy to smirk. "This would have impressed Mihawk, you know," Luffy said, causing Zoro's eyes to widen as he withdrew his blade and swiped off the blood, taking a few steps back. "Now do you want to finish this off?" Luffy asked, flipping his blades to the flat edge. "Alright," Zoro said as he angled his swords together, forming a triangle before he started spinning them at a rapid pace. Luffy brought his swords up at an angle and dropped into a stance. "Notoryu," he said as Zoro's swords began to blur together. "Santoryu Aogi," Zoro said, continuing to rotate his swords. Sans and Sekai. He exclaimed as he and Luffy clashed for a split second before stopping with a short distance between them both. Funside Ejeki. Luffy said after a moment of silence which was accompanied by the sound of shattering steel and a body collapsing to the ground. Standing and turning towards Zoro, Luffy saw that Zoro was on one knee and panting for breath, the two hilts of his shattered swords clenched in his hands. "Can you stand, Zoro?" Luffy asked curiously. "Yeah." Zoro said as he struggled to stand up. "I think you broke some of my ribs, though," he muttered, putting a hand on his chest and pulling away his hand as if it was burned. That was the point of that technique, it's mainly used to incapacitate the enemy or break their weapons. Luffy explained as he dissipated his swords and walked towards Zoro. "Lift up your shirt," Luffy said in a flat tone. "Huh?" Zoro asked as he tied his bandana to his left bicep. "Well, I've got to see the injury to see if it's fatal or not," Luffy explained with an "are you an idiot" tone. "Now come on, lift it up," Luffy said with a hurried motion to his hand. With a sigh, Zoro lifted his shirt enough to show his chest, which caused Luffy wince when he saw Zoro's injury. "Ouch, that looks really painful," he muttered. Standing up, Luffy lightly clapped his hands together. "Alright, we need some ice on your injury," he said. "Is it that bad?" Zoro asked with a raised brow. "There's no broken bones, but there's definitely multiple fractures, but hey, it could just be a lot of cracked bones, in which case, you won't be bedridden," Luffy said with a light-hearted tone. "Well, I could just walk this off," Zoro said with an indifferent shrug. "No, you can't, idiot. We need Kaya to treat this," Luffy said, putting his hand on Zoro's shoulder. "It'll be fine, I'll just leave it to heal," the green-haired swordsman said as he shrugged off Luffy's hand and began to walk away. "You leave me no choice," Luffy said after a moment, causing Zoro to stop in confusion and turn around. But Zoro's question was stopped by a swift chop to the neck, knocking him out cold and dropping him like a brick until he was caught in Luffy's arm. "You're getting that injury treated," Luffy said to Zoro's unconscious form before glancing at the girl's room. "Now to wake Kaya," he muttered. Short skip. Zoro groaned as he blinked his eyes open. "Where am I?" he groaned, sitting up from the bed he was sleeping in. "Luffy's room." A feminine voice sounded from the corner of the room. Zoro looked over and saw Kaya sitting at Luffy's desk, flipping through a medical book. "Why?" "So that I could treat you, of course," Kaya said, turning in the office chair to face him with a smile on her face. Looking down at his chest, Zoro saw that it was bandaged and felt numb. "Why does my chest feel numb?" he asked curiously. "Oh, those are the painkillers that I gave you," Kaya said as she stood from the chair. "You're lucky that the worst injuries you got were some cracked bones," she said, walking to the door. "Is Luffy outside?" Zoro asked curiously. "I gotta ask him something." "Yeah, he and the others are waiting for Nami to get on board so we can leave," Kaya said, her hand on the door handle. "Alright," Zoro said, grunting as he stood from the bed, "let's go," he said as he grabbed his sword from the bedside and put it on his right hip. Kaya looked to want to say something but stopped. "Okay," she said, opening the door and walking out with Zoro in tow. On the back of the ship, Luffy, Jin, Johnny, Yasaku, Usopp and Ajiko were all standing and waiting for Nami to show up at the dock with the rest of the village so that they could say goodbye. "Remember to pass those flags around the island and put them up soon enough, nobody will lay a finger on this island and you'll all be safe," Luffy called out to the villagers, nodding to the stack of black cloth near Genzo's feet. "Of course we will, it's the least we could do after all you've done," Genzo said with a tone of respect. "Anyway," Luffy said turning to Johnny and Yasaku, "are you two sure you want to come along?" Luffy asked curiously. "Absolutely, your fight with Arlong showed us that we have a lot to learn, especially if we can barely take on the Smalfries of the East Blue," Johnny said seriously. "You do know that both of you will have pretty big bounties by the time you're ready, don't you?" Luffy asked with a raised eyebrow. Nodding, Yasaku spoke up with determination. "Yeah we do, Luffy Nikki, but we still want to get stronger." Sighing, Luffy scratched the back of his head. "Alright then, if you want, you two can join," Luffy said with a shrug, seeing no way that he could argue with the two. "Hey, it's Nami," one of the villagers shouted, grabbing the pirate's attention. Looking at the redeed, they saw that she had her head down. "Is she alright?" Luffy asked after a moment. "Maybe," Jin said in response, looking curiously at Nami. Nami seemed to take a deep breath before she shouted something that shocked them. "Set the sails." Luffy blinked multiple times before he smirked and turned to his unmoving crew. "Didn't you hear her? Set the sails, we're outta here," Luffy exclaimed, looking at his crew, who all began to hurry around the ship in a flurry of activity. "Wait up, aren't you gonna take her first?" Genzo shouted in confusion as the Going Merry began to leave port. As if to make things more confusing, Nami began to sprint through the crowd of villagers, weaving through each of them, taking sharp turns, rounding back and slipping past each and every one of the dumbfounded citizens. "The hell is she doing?" Jin questioned in a gruff and curious tone. Saying goodbye in her own little way. Luffy said with a small smirk, leaning against the railing. Nami, what are you doing? Stop. At least just say goodbye. The collective shouts of the villagers included those previously stated and collections of what the hell. And stop right there. When the Going Merry was almost out of reach, Nami reached the end of the dock and leaped in a single powerful bound and cleared the distance between the ship and the dock, gently landing on the railing next to Luffy with grace. Welcome aboard. Luffy said with a sarcastically as his navigator stepped off the railing and pulled her shirt up past her belly button, causing numerous wallets and coin purses with money bills and coins spilling out in a small torrent, all piling around her feet. I hope that this doesn't become a habit. Luffy muttered with a small shake to his head. Don't worry about it, Captain, I'll only do this to strangers. Nami said mischievously, picking up a bill between her middle finger and forefinger and giving it a small kiss. Take care everybody. She said, tossing a wink to the villagers who all wore angry, shark-tooth expressions. That rat. She got us again. They all shouted in shock. Take care of yourselves. I'll miss you. Nami shouted out with a grin as she waved in farewell. We'll miss you, you damn brat. Genzo shouted. Everyone at the dock was waving and shouting farewells with wide grins on their faces. Hey, kid. Genzo shouted, catching Luffy's attention. Remember what I told you, alright. He shouted. I'll remember, old man. Luffy shouted back with a small grin as the ship continued to sail off, further and further away from Nami's home island, the voices of the people growing fainter until they slowly thinned away to nothing. Chapter 12. It's been a couple days since the crew departed from Kokoyashi, and Luffy was sitting in his room, idly holding what looked like a glass sphere that was held in place by what looked like the wooden makings of an hourglass. Inside the glass sphere was a compass needle that was pointing in a southwestern direction. In Luffy's hand was an eternal pose, a more I guess you could say sophisticated or simplistic creation of the log pose. On the base of the eternal pose was a small plaque that read a name that was too worn off to read clearly, but Luffy knew what the island was for and who stayed there. Placing the pose on his desk, Luffy reached into one of the drawers and pulled out a velvet box and opened it, being greeted with the sight of a log pose, and stood from his chair, whilst pocketing the velvet box, and left through the door to the main deck. Out on the main deck, Luffy saw that Nami and Najiko were chatting back and forth, Zoro was resting against the side railing, Sanji was nowhere to be seen, so he was probably in the kitchen, Jin was relaxing near Zoro, Usopp was speaking with Kaya about random things, and Johnny and Yasaku looked to be exercising. It's like this crew almost runs itself. Luffy thought, walking down the steps. Jin, Johnny, Yasaku and Najiko, gather round, I got something to tell you. You too Sanji. Luffy said loudly. In a few moments, the aforementioned people made a semicircle around Luffy and sat down, while the rest all watched on interestedly. Breathing out, Luffy gained a serious look to his face. Listen up, after this island, we're going to the second most dangerous stretch of sea we'll ever experience on our journey, the Grand Line. Luffy said, pausing for a moment, he saw that Jin's eyes widened in what looked like fear and Sanji's eyebrow perk up in curiosity. Don't worry though, I know enough about the Grand Line to get us through with minimal casualties. Luffy went on, causing worried eyes to glance to and fro between each other. But, the Grand Line is merciless, so you'll all have to train to your absolute best potential to survive there, so I've decided to teach you all in something called HAKI and other techniques that will help you survive. I will have you know, however, that the training will be harsh and extensive. Luffy explained to his crew. Sanji raised his hand in questioning, getting a nod from Luffy, he spoke. What techniques are you gonna teach us? First, there's Soru, this technique allows you to move fast enough to make it seem like you vanish and reappear somewhere else by kicking the ground dozens of times in a split second. Luffy answered. Here, let me demonstrate. He said before dashing around and behind Sanji with his back turned in the blink of an eye. This is the speed of Soru. He whispered out. Sanji turned around wittied when Luffy appeared behind him as if he teleported. Whoa, that's so cool. Yasaku muttered with Johnny nodding silently in agreement. Dashing back to his previous spot, Luffy continued his explanation. To do this technique without fail, you need monstrous leg strength, which requires plenty of training, obviously. He said, looking over his crew. Next is a technique called Geppo. This is like Soru, but instead you use it when you want to become airborne and propel yourself through the air as if you're flying. This, like Soru, requires monstrous leg strength and speed. Luffy explained as he kicked the air, lifting him off of the ground by a few meters, surprising the onlookers that haven't seen it in action before. Luffy continued to lightly kick the air below him, keeping himself hovering in the air with ease for a few moments before he let up and landed softly back on the deck. Now, this final technique that you will learn with HAKI is called Rankyaku. This technique is basically kicking through the air so fast that create an airblade as if it came from a sword. Luffy explained. As he was going to explain the technique further, he sensed a large presence right next to the ship and he knew it was a small sea king, but it was large enough. Perfect timing. Luffy said, confusing the crew until a monstrous creature broke the blue ocean surface and towered over the crew with a glare in its eyes. The crew tensed and the combatancy members prepared to fight when Luffy stopped them. Now, Luffy said, rolling his shoulders. I believe it's time to demonstrate Rankyaku to you all. He casually said before disappearing and reappearing in the air next to the beast's neck with his leg raised, ready to strike. Rankyaku. He said before throwing his leg out in a sidekick with his toe crashing into the monster's neck with tremendous force, causing the Sea King to reel back in pain before a red line appeared across its neck where Luffy kicked it, Suhei Tatsu. He said before he landed on the deck of the ship. The gargantuan Sea King froze with its eyes wide in what looked like shock and fear and its head slowly slid off of its body at the red line and splashed down into the water with a loud crash and water raining down in a mist. A moment later, blood sprayed out of its neck like a crimson fountain before it rained down in a downpour of blood that covered half of the deck in a bloody pool and covered Luffy, giving him an entirely different appearance from his usual self, making him look sinister and murderous. That, Luffy started, catching his crew's attention, was a simple use of Rankyaku. There are a lot of ways to use it. There's even a second style where you use the heel of your foot to send out a blunt airblade to stun your target. He explained, shaking his head side to side, trying to get the blood out of his hair and off of his face. Looks like I need a shower. He muttered to himself. Anyway, Zoro. Nami. Luffy exclaimed, gaining their attention. Explain HAKI to everyone here while I go clean myself up. I'll be back in a bit. He said, walking over to the washroom. As Luffy disappeared into the ship, the rest of the crew left their eyes on the door for a moment. Hey, we need to explain HAKI to them, so let's do it. Zoro gruffly called out, receiving silence in return. Turning to the orange-haired woman, Zoro called out again. Hey, Nahum. The hell's wrong with you? He asked with a raised brow, seeing Nami's form shocked still with wide eyes and a gaping mouth and a foreboding aura about her. Hey? Nami-san. Are you alright? Sanji asked with a worried look. WWWHWH. The woman stuttered under her breath in what seemed like shock as she clenched a newspaper in her shaking hands. Nami? Are you alright? You're scaring us. Usopp asked looking really worried, then turned to Kaya. Kaya, is she alright? He asked the nurse. Walking up to the orange-haired woman, Kaya leaned down and placed her hand on Nami's forehead to check her temperature before sighing and looking at the paper. She's fine, just being overdramatic. Kaya said, grabbing the paper from Nami's hands and showing it to the crew, causing their jaws to drop in shock. Seriously? Usopp exclaimed. Zoro just smirked in response and Sanji looked jealous and angry at the same time. Jin looked to be expecting whatever was happening and had no outward reaction. Nijiko's eyes widened in surprise, while Johnny and Yasaku looked to be in awe. In the washroom, Luffy just stepped out with a towel wrapped around his waist as he used another to dry his hair. That was really refreshing. I want to go to a hot spring just to relax. He said wistfully, getting out a new set of clothes and changing into them, not forgetting his sword and hat of course. Luffy's new set of clothes was just a simple red open vest with blue knee-length shorts and a black wristband and a silver bracelet on his left arm. Walking out to the deck, he saw his crew standing in a semicircle all looking at something that Kaya was holding and raised a brow. What are they looking at? Luffy thought, using Zoro to dash over behind Kaya and snatch away what she was holding, causing her to yelp in shock and turn to him. This is what you're all shocked about? Luffy questioned after a moment, looking at his crew. In any case, congrats, Zoro, Sanji, Jin. He exclaimed looking proudly at the wanted posters in the paper. You've all gotten bounties as part of the Sub-Zero Pirates. Luffy said with a grin. Indeed, on the paper were bounty posters for Jin, Sanji, and Zoro. It read, wanted. Dead or alive, pirate hunter Rorano Zoro. Bounty, 45 million beris. This caused Zoro to smirk widely in pride and smugness. His picture showed him glaring with his bandana on his head and his sword in his mouth, making him look ferocious. Wanted. Dead or alive, Blackleg Sanji. Bounty, 35 million beris. Sanji also smirked but glared at Zoro as he saw the smug glint in his eye when he looked directly at him. His bounty photo showed him lighting a cigarette and his face being slightly illuminated by the flame of the lighter. Wanted. Dead or alive, Mandamin Jin. Bounty, 25 million beris. Jin didn't seem to mind much and just let the side of his mouth perk up the slightest bit in pride at his large bounty, in East Blue standards. His bounty picture showed a side profile of him with his two tonfa clutched in his hands. This is really cool. Luffy muttered before walking towards his cabin. What are you doing? Gonna hang 'em up in my cabin. Luffy said, not turning around. They'll be updated as your bounties rise as well. He said with a small smile. Still, great first bounties, guys. The captain said with a grin as he turned his head to his crew. Chapter 13. Luffy was resting on the figurehead of the Going Merry, with his eyes closed in deep thought about his crew. Now that Zoro, Sanji and Jin have bounties, they're going to need to be more careful. He thought to himself, opening his eyes and being greeted by the sight of the clear sky that was the deepest of blues with a stray cloud drifting by. Our next stop should be Lobetown, if I remember correctly. Luffy thought before Nami's voice broke him out of his thoughts. Everyone, we're nearing Lobetown. So don't cause any trouble. Nami called out, looking pointedly at Luffy. Why me? Luffy thought in genuine confusion. We should at least wait to get to the port, but we should probably hide away the flag and sail to avoid any suspicion. Luffy said, standing from his spot. I also heard that some marines were stationed there recently and are led by a powerful captain named Smoker. Luffy explained as he walked down to the deck. Marines, huh? Zoro muttered before looking up. Then that means that you, me, Curly Brow and Jin have to hide ourselves so that we don't start trouble. Zoro said, glancing over Luffy, Jin and Sanji. Of course we do. Now all you have to do is figure out your disguises and what you're going to do at Lobetown. Luffy said as he walked into his room, the door closing shut behind him. Short skip. Luffy stepped out of his room with his hair a frozen white and his eyes an icy blue. He was wearing his trusty straw hat on his head with his sword at his side, a white dress shirt that had the top 2 buttons unbuttoned and the sleeves rolled up to his elbows with a grey vest over it and pair of black dress pants with matching shoes. Strangely, though, Luffy's left arm wasn't ice, but instead, it looked just like it was flesh. On the deck, everyone was ready to go as the ship neared Lobetown. Squinting his eyes, Luffy thought he could see something at the dock. Usopp. Hand me your spyglass. He exclaimed, causing the long-nosed sniper to hurry and give it to him. Placing his eye up to the tool and closing the other eye, he focused on the suspicious object, only for his eyes to widen in shock, slight fear, and surprise. Through the eyeglass, Luffy saw a large marine battleship docked at the town, but what most shocked him was the figurehead. The figurehead of the ship had a heavy resemblance to a bulldog with a bone clutched in its pair of jaws. What the hell is that psychotic old man doing here? Luffy muttered to himself with confusion. Luffy, what'd you see? Usopp questioned. Curiously, Luffy lowered the spyglass from his face and slightly gulped. It's a marine battleship. He said silently. So? You already said that a powerful marine was stationed here. Jin said nonchalantly. I know I said that and I'm not wrong about the marine stationed there. Luffy said, bringing curious glances to him. However, the marine that is in control of that battleship would make all of you all seem like nothing but little children or less with how crazy strong he is. He said seriously, causing his crew's eyes to widen. Then what are we gonna do? We gotta restock on supplies. Nami said with fear present in her voice. They'll find me no matter what, so you all need to stay away from a tall old guy with a scar on his face. Luffy warned. Who is this guy, anyway? Zodo asked curiously. He's Vice Admiral Garp from Marine HQ. Luffy said bluntly, causing the whole crew's eyes to widen again. Nami seemed to be thinking about something briefly before she gasped in horror. Why, you don't mean Garp the Fist, right? Of course I do. Now all of you stay away from him, I'll be in town, finding a weapons store to get some things. Luffy said, walking down to the deck. Now that you mention it, I need to buy some things. Zoro said, thinking aloud, unknowing to the sly and greedy glint that shined in Nami's eyes as she walked up to him. Oh, you're in need of money? She asked with false innocence, nonetheless Zoro nodded. Well, I'll lend you some money at 300% interest. Nami said with a grin that hid many ill wills to the financial status of the green-haired swordsman. Zoro looked to agree before Luffy grabbed his shoulder, saving him from much foreseen debt. Don't worry Zoro, I'll cover it for you. And you won't be in debt forever. He thought with a drop of sweat rolling down his head. Ah, wait, Luffy said, blinking in realization, Najiko. He called out, gaining the woman's attention. You're coming with me, you gotta get a weapon too. He reminded her. Oh yeah, well lead the way then, Captain. She said with a smile. You got your money? Luffy asked her, gaining a nod in response. Good, I don't want to end up owing too many people. He muttered before perking up. Now, let's head into town. Luffy said, already heading off the ship with Zoro and Najiko in tow before stopping and turning back to the ship. If you run into me or are with me, refer to me as Shimo, alright. Alright. Luffy said, continuing to walk. What about the rest of us? Usopp called out. Luffy stayed silent for a moment and thought. One of you stay guard, the rest of you buy what you need, and that's it, plus, don't get scammed. He said, continuing his trek into the town. Scene skip AN. I'm winging this whole thing, so, I'm sorry if I fuck it up. Throughout the walk through the town, Luffy was keeping an eye out for Garp when a gruff voice broke him out of his thoughts. Looking over, Luffy saw that there was a crowd of people surrounding a fight between 3 people. In the center, there was one woman carrying something that was wrapped in cloth, facing off against 2 roguish men who looked smug but angry, somehow. Now that you're alone, we can take revenge for our leader. One of the men said, holding his sword tight in his hands. After a silent moment, the woman spoke up. Fine then, if you haven't already learned your lesson, I shall gladly be your opponent. She said with a quiet tone. Did I just hear you correctly? A little miss like you is gonna take us on? One of the men asked arrogantly. Well, why not? The other asked rhetorically. Lunging at the woman, the two men got wicked grins on their faces. Well, when you die, tell that monster friend of yours, the first man started, that our dreams of going to the Grand Line were shattered because of him. The other finished. The woman stood silently as she reached to the object in her hand and gripped it. Zoro hummed questioningly, noticing that Luffy slightly narrowed his eyes. What is it? You'll see. Luffy said simply. In an instant, the woman had appeared past the two pirates in a crouched position with her sword held in both hands over her head and behind her back. The two pirates collapsed in an unconscious heap with blood oozing from their wounds. The crowd surrounding stood shocked as the woman coolly sheathed her sword and began to walk away. Without looking back. At least until she tripped, causing her glasses to fall off. The crowd that was still gathered began laughing at the woman's slight misfortune. Ain't you a strong one, missy? One of the civilians exclaimed in a slight teasing tone. The woman began to feel around the ground for her glasses, muttering to herself, not knowing that her glasses had fallen at Zoro's feet. Bending down, Zoro picked up the woman's glasses and held them out to her. These yours? He asked rhetorically. Reaching out and grabbing them from the green-haired swordsman's hand, she put them on with a slight blush of embarrassment. Thank you. Sorry for bothering you. She said in a grateful tone. Zoro stayed in what seemed like a shocked silence, so Luffy stepped in himself. It's really no problem, but if you'll excuse me and my friend here, we need to be heading off. He said, grabbing Zoro by the arm and pulling him up. Come on Negico. We really need to be heading off. Luffy began walking off with Zoro and Negico in tow, not letting the woman introduce herself. Scene skip. This looks to be the arms shop. Luffy said. I wonder. Maybe it's because of the sign that says arms shop with gigantic letters in bold print. Negico said sarcastically. Negico, I could really do without your sarcasm right now. Luffy said, walking in through the shop doors, shortly followed by Zoro and Negico. Negico, Zoro, go find yourself some swords. He said, walking up to the counter that was watched by a balding man with a red nose. Welcome to my store, valued customer, what can I do for you? He asked in a fake cheery voice. So, he's greedy. Luffy thought before pulling his sword off of his hip and placing it on the counter. I need this appraised. He bluntly stated, noting the man's shocked expression and the amount of sweat that pouring down his face. The shopkeeper drew the sword out of its sheath, gaining an extremely shocked expression on his face at seeing the blade. It must be of great grade then. Luffy thought to himself. The shopkeeper cleared his throat and was about to speak when a shocked gasp interrupted them. Is that what I think it is? A feminine voice exclaimed. Looking at the source, which was now right next to him somehow, he noticed that it was the woman from earlier, and she was closely studying his sword and looking at it like it was a national treasure. It is. She exclaimed, pulling out a small handbook and flipping to a certain page. It's one of the 12 Sage Malwazamono, the reism Kijin. It couldn't be bought for less than 50 million beris. The woman exclaimed with glee, causing the shopkeeper to grow angry. You damn woman. You told him everything. I should sue you for obstruction of business. The man shouted in complete fury, confusing the woman. Obstruction of business. Did I say something wrong? She asked curiously. No, you didn't. You actually answered my question faster than he ever could. Luffy said, jabbing a thumb at the shopkeeper. You came for your Shigeru, right? The man asked, reaching under his desk and pulling out a sword that was in a green sheath. Here, take it. It's been polished and sharpened. He shouted, throwing the sword at her. The woman stumbled in surprise, but managed to get a handle on it before she fell, releasing a sigh of relief. Hey, Lushimo. Negico called from where she was. I found what sword I want. She said enthusiastically. What is it? Shimo asked curiously, walking over to Negico. In Negico's hand was a silver thin, long, double-edged sword with a wide handle guard that was intricately designed. A rapier, huh? Shimo asked interestedly. Yeah, it feels right with me, I can't explain it. Negico said, looking the thin blade up and down. That's the point, the sword is supposed to fade. Luffy suddenly stopped in his explanation as he felt a very sinister presence that was leaking bloodlust and insanity. Shimo? Negico asked worriedly. Looking over at the source with wide eyes, Luffy saw Zoro holding a sword in his hand that had a grayish flame design on the blade. Zoro, that blade is cursed. I'm not sure you should buy that one. Luffy warned his swordsman, causing the storekeeper to look at him. Yeah, it's cursed, have you heard of it before? He asked. No, I can just sense the bloodlust from that sword, it's insane. Luffy said, keeping his eyes on the blade. Zoro looked the blade up and down before smirking. Heh, I'll take it. Zoro said with excitement in his voice. Sir. I won't sell it to you. If I sold you Sandai Kitetsu, it'd be like I'm the one that killed you due to that thing's dumb curse. The shopkeeper exclaimed. Then how about this? Zoro asked out, bringing all of the attention onto him. How about I put my luck against this thing's curse? He continued, tossing the blade up in the air. If I lose, that just means that I wasn't meant to go this far as a swordsman. He said, sticking his left arm in the sword's path and closing his eyes, shocking everyone in the shop. Stop. If you do that you'll lose your arm. That thing's sharpness is the real deal. The old man shouted. The woman put her hands to her mouth as she gasped in shock. Najiko looked ready to jump in, but was stopped by Luffy. Snapping her head to him, she could tell that he was just as worried as her, but couldn't interfere. As if in slow motion, the sword spun at Zoro's arm, the sword's sharp edge missing by just a hair and the flat edge of the blade just about touching his arm as the sword harmlessly fell and sunk, hilt deep into the wooden floor of the shop. Opening his eyes and smirking, Zoro said 3 simple words. I'll take it. Zoro grabbed the hilt of Kitetsu and brought it out, sheathing it on his hip. Pointing at the woman that had collapsed to her knees, Zoro told her to find him another sword. Wait. The shopkeeper said, reaching below the counter and grabbing a sword that was on a stand. This is my family heirloom, Yubashiri. I've been looking to sell it, but I might as well give to you for free, along with Kitetsu. He said. Well, alright. Zoro said with a smirk. Meanwhile, Luffy was sifting through one of the barrels that Kitetsu came from, hoping to find something, but stopped when he sensed an immense amount of darkness from one of the swords. Reaching into one of the barrels, he pulled out a sword that had a black sheath and a red handle with a string tied on the sheath, with a small skull on the end of one the knot ends. Unsheathing the blade, Luffy saw a crimson fracture-like design going down the middle of the blade that branched off to the edges. What's the name of this blade? Do you know, sword girl? Luffy asked curiously, still looking at the blade. Ah. It says here that it's called Chiki Hayden, it's one of the 12 sage Malwazamono. The girl explained. Smirking, Luffy sheathed the sword and placed it on his hip. Then I'll take it and the silver rapier. Luffy said as he walked to the counter. How much? He asked. Normally it'd be 375,000 Barris, but I'll give you half off, so 190,000 Barris. He said. Deal, Luffy said, digging in his pocket and pulling out a coin purse. Reaching in and grabbing a few gold coins in his fingers, he dropped them onto the counter. This should be enough. Have a nice day. He said, leaving the shop with Najiko and Zoro in tow. As they left the shop, Zoro looked at Luffy suspiciously. That wasn't enough, was it? Najiko looked up from adjusting her rapier on her hip in curiosity. Luffy gave a nonchalant shrug and replied with an indifferent tone, doesn't matter anyway, we're pirates. Luffy said, placing a hand on his new blade. Plus we got a major discount anyway. He said with a smirk. Now, then, I'm gonna go to the town square, you two can do what you want, I'm gonna see the execution stand. Alright, just don't cause too much trouble. Zoro said, walking off in a random direction. Where are you going? Najiko asked curiously. Back to the ship, where else? That's the wrong way, the ship is that way. Najiko said, pointing opposite of where he was walking, causing him to sweat drop. I knew that. He muttered, walking the direction she pointed. Anyway, I better find Nami, she probably scammed a shopkeeper by now. Najiko said, walking towards the market. With Luffy, so that's the execution stand. Luffy said, looking up at the tall structure. The end of one great era and the beginning of another. He said before gaining a curious glint in his eyes. I wonder what the view is like. He wondered, walking up to the stand and curling a hand around a steel beam. Putting a foot on a steel beam, he began to fluidly climb the execution stand without problems, and soon enough, he was standing on the top of the structure looking over the town. So this was what Gold D. Roger saw before he died, huh? Luffy muttered to himself. His peaceful thoughts, however, were broken by a loud voice coming from below. Sir. Please get down from there. That is a national monument that belongs to the world government. A man in an officer's uniform stood at the bottom of the execution stand with a megaphone to his mouth. Maybe I want to stay up here. Luffy retorted, smirking down at the officer. Sir. Get down. The man's order was stopped short by an iron mace crashing into his skull and throwing him to the side. An iron mace? Luffy thought curiously. Now, don't be so uptight about the rules, Mr. Officer. A feminine voice said coyly. Looking over at the woman, he saw that she had long black hair and wore a cowboy hat, that being all he could see due to the long cloak that covered her body. The woman looked up at Luffy and recognition flashed through her eyes. I've been looking all over for you, Luffy. It's been a while. She said with a smile, unknowingly giving Luffy a small heart attack. How the hell did she see through my disguise? How did she even know my name? He thought in shock and confusion. Only you could be so carefree about breaking the law, seeing as you're a pirate. The woman said with a smile. But don't tell me that you've forgotten this face. The men and women in the crowd began to cheer on her beauty and fawn over her, as if she was a goddess. I'm sorry, but I don't ever remember meeting you. Luffy said, trying to search his memory of meeting her, but coming up blank. Who are you? I could never forget you, how you struck my beautiful body with such powerful force. She said, gingerly place her hand on her cheek. I hit you? Luffy asked with a sweat drop as his memory narrowed down to fewer memories of women he fought before. I hope it's not who I think it is. The way you handled me was so rough, the woman said, looking as if the thought of it alone left her in ecstasy. It left me absolutely breathless. She said with a wide smile and a blissful sigh. I really hope it's not her. Luffy said, multiple drops of sweat going down the back of his head. Now tell me, everyone. She shouted out, turning to the crowd with her arms out wide. Who is the most beautiful woman of the seas? It would be you, of course. They all shouted in response. Yes, it is me indeed. All men in the world would bend at their knee for me. She said with pride. However, I only have love for powerful men. That, my Luffy, is why I will make you mine once and for all. She said, looking Luffy in the eyes. Don't tell me, Luffy muttered, you're Alvida, aren't you? He asked the woman. You figured it, have you? Alvida asked back. I see, she must have eaten a devil fruit, but which one? Luffy thought curiously. But I've got to know, how did you see through my disguise? Luffy asked, letting his disguise fall, scaring all of the bystanders. That's for me to know and you to find out. She said coyly. Ah. It's HAKI Luffy. One of the citizens shouted in fear. This is the police. You there, freeze. You're under arrest for assaulting a police officer. And you on the stand, get down here. A police officer said, leading a small squad that all had hearts for eyes. Oh? Alvida said with a devious smile. You came here to arrest little Almi? She asked in a false innocent tone. Yes sir. We can't capture her, she's too beautiful. One of the officers exclaimed with a smitten expression. Who cares about her beauty? Just capture her. The leader said with an angry expression that was ruined by his bright blush and heart-shaped eyes. Suddenly, the fountain that was nearby was launched from its foundation by a large explosion that was accompanied by an angered voice. Die. The rubble flew at Alvida, who stood in her spot as the fragmentations of rock simply slid helplessly off of her skin. My, wasn't that quite dangerous? Alvida asked lightheartedly. My apologies, but with your smooth skin, you should be completely unharmed. A man in a cloak said. Luffy noticed only one thing about the man, and that was that a large tomato nose was the only thing visible from under the cloak. Oh god, Luffy said, facepalming and letting out an exasperated sigh, please tell me that isn't who I think it is. He muttered to himself. Anyway, what fruit did you eat that changed your appearance so much? Luffy asked Alvida. I'm glad you noticed, the name of the fruit was the Sub no Mi, even though it didn't change my beauty, it simply smoothed out my skin. Alvida said in seemingly disappointed tone. I think a lot more than that changed. Luffy thought with a sweat drop. In any case, if you're really worthy to be my man, then you certainly shouldn't be able to lose to this man that I've teamed up with for the sole purpose of locating you. Alvida said, motioning to the cloaked man behind her. As if on cue, he and dozens of other cloaked figures flung their cloaks off with a flourish, causing a sweat drop to form on Luffy's head once again. Ever since I was defeated and I was left behind, I found my way back to my crew, all the while pining after the chance to kill you. The main cloaked figure turned out to be Buggy the Clown. It was quite the adventure for I, who was gravely injured and left behind to die by you. An adventure of friendship, merriments, and hellish dangers. A grand adventure for the great Buggy. After much perseverance, Buggy stopped and blinked a couple times in realization before it turned to anger. Wait, what the hell am I telling you this for? Are you that idiotic? Luffy shouted in exasperation. Whatever, I need to leave and you aren't worth my time. He said nonchalantly, standing to jump off the execution stand. You're still as arrogant as ever, brat. Buggy shouted. Make way for Buggy the Clown. One of Buggy's minions shouted, holding a pistol to the civilians. Don't any of you dare to run away. I will show you all the terror of Buggy the Clown. The clown said. As Luffy was going to jump off the execution stand, he felt a presence falling rapidly towards him. Stepping back, he dodged a wooden stock that would have held him down and raised his leg high. The man who was on the wooden stock was Buggy's swordsman, Kabaji, and he was shocked to say the least that Luffy had dodged him without looking. With a great amount of force, Luffy dropped his heel onto Kabaji's head and drove it into the wooden platform, cracking and splintering the hard material and knocking the man unconscious. It seems your own cowardice trails to your crew as well, Red Nose. Luffy said quietly, taking his leg off of Kabaji's head and jumping down from the execution stand, landing gracefully on the ground and walking towards Alvida, not even sparing Buggy a glance as he passed him by. You straw hat brat. Who the hell do you think you are, ignoring me like that? Buggy shouted in anger. Someone who doesn't deal with obnoxious idiots, obviously. Luffy said coolly. Hey Alvida. Yes? She asked with a smile, keeping her eyes on Luffy. You said you teamed up with Buggy just to find me, right? Luffy asked, wanting confirmation. MHM. She confirmed with a nod, walking closer to Luffy. Then, how about you sail with me and my crew and become a member of the Sub-Zero Pirates? Luffy asked with a small smirk, holding his hand out. Alvida blinked in surprise at Luffy's offer, obviously not expecting it. After a moment of consideration and thought, she let a small smile come on her face and grasped Luffy's hand in her own. Alright, I'll join you on your little voyage, Captain. She agreed, causing Luffy to smirk. Alright, let's get going. Luffy said, turning to walk towards the docks. Shouldn't we take care of the people here first? Don't worry about that, I've got it. Luffy assured, letting out a concentrated and powerful blast of HAKI, knocking out the pirates and Buggy in the square and the marines that were hidden away around the town square. Alvida's eyes widened as she felt a shiver run up and down her spine as a wave of power crashed over her like a tidal wave. There, now we should be unbothered on the way back, at least somewhat. Luffy said as he jogged to the docks with Alvida in tow. What was the just now? Alvida questioned as she tried to keep up. I'll explain later, for now we got trouble coming at us, and fast. Luffy warned as he felt a number of unknown presences approaching him and Alvida rapidly, two being immensely stronger than the others. One of them is definitely Gramps, but who's the other one? He thought curiously with slightly narrowed eyes. Hey. You're from the arms shop, aren't you? You bought Cheeky Hayden and you have Riazm Kitchen, don't you? A feminine voice shouted out from in front of them. Looking at the source, Luffy recognized a woman as the sword girl from the arms shop. Yeah, I did and do, so what? Luffy questioned rudely. You're the people that I hate most, using swords for your own selfish needs. You're making the swords cry in grief. She said with her brow furrowed in what seemed like anger. With me being a swordsman myself, I will retrieve all of the masterpiece swords from evil criminals like you. She exclaimed, drawing Shigure and holding it in front of her in a kendo stance. Alvida, keep on going. You might run into Zoro, just tell him what happened and he'll most likely get you to the docks. Luffy said, drawing Riazm. Nodding in confirmation, she hurried away and towards the docks. Are you not going to use your second one? The woman questioned. Sorry to sound rude, but I won't need it. Luffy said, pointing his sword at her. This caused the girl's eyes to narrow in anger and frustration. She charged ahead at Luffy with her sword ready to strike. Luffy simply sighed and sidestepped the reckless attack and couldn't help but remember his duel with Shanks when he was still in training. Shanks riled him up so much that he became reckless and ultimately lost the duel with a humiliating defeat. You're not ready for me or my swordsman's skill yet, so train and get stronger to get these swords, or you'll never get close to retrieving any of them from either of us. Luffy said, narrowing his gaze on the woman. Why won't you fight me seriously? The woman shouted furiously as she rounded on her heel towards Luffy. I'm not the type of man to use a cannon on a fly. Luffy said coldly, glaring at the woman. Nearby, a lightning bolt struck near the town square, and very soon after, it started to pour rain in a torrent of water that pelted their skin. Enraged, the swordswoman ran at Luffy at high speeds that may have looked like a blur to some, but Luffy could see her movements as clear as day. Bringing his sword up, he easily parried her strike and struck her on top of her head with the blunt side of the sword, causing her to reel back in pain. Fight me seriously? She exclaimed in frustration, gritting her teeth. Her angry expression turned to shock and fear when she felt something cold and sharp at her jugular. Looking down, she saw the blade of Riazm ready to end her life when cold realization set in. I'm not strong enough to save these swords. She thought with dread. I will take you seriously when you get strong enough to take my swordsman on in a fair fight. Luffy said as he sheathed his sword. Until we meet again, get stronger to take us on and get the swords from us. If you're curious as to why I included my swordsman, he was the green-haired one with me, Roronoa Zoro, he also has Wad Michimanji. He told her as he sprinted towards the docks, leaving her in shock. That guy was Roronoa Zoro. He has Wadm, too. She thought before gritting her teeth in determination. I will get those swords back. Up ahead with Luffy, he had caught up to Zoro, Alvida and Sanji, which was odd because they should be at the ship right now, right? Wrong. They were stopped by a white-haired man with 2 cigars in his mouth and jit in his hand, his face set in stone with determination, and a 3-wheeled motorcycle near him. The man caught Luffy in his side and his expression didn't change. So you've come HAKI Luffy? He asked rhetorically. The three turned and saw Luffy running towards them. Luffy. So you beat that sword girl? Zoro asked curiously, turning back to the man. You took down Tashigi? Well, no matter, I'll still stop you all from escaping, no matter what. The man said, pointing his jit at the 4 pirates. Putting HAKI into his hand, Luffy dashed forward at the smoking man with surprising speed and punched him in the jaw, launching him into the building next to them, kicking up a dust cloud. You 3 get to the ship, I'll take him down. Luffy ordered, hardening his second hand with HAKI. Alright, meet us there, Luffy. Zoro said, running to the ship with the others in tow. He managed to hit me? The man muttered in shock, holding his jaw. Of course you would be shocked, Lojas that think they're invincible are always the ones that are defeated the easiest. Luffy said, looking at the slowly standing man. The man looked at Luffy's hands and realization dawned on him. HAKI, huh? I shouldn't be surprised, you already used that power in the square. He said, standing up. Who are you? Luffy asked curiously. The name's Smoker, a captain from Marine headquarters, and I won't let you set sail from this island. Smoker exclaimed, throwing his arms out with billowing smoke pouring out in thick clouds. Seamlessly, Luffy dodged the trails of smoke and dashed straight at Smoker, with his fingers curled up and his palm ready to strike. If you've seen Soul Eater, think of Stein when he strikes with his soul waves. Planting his foot on the ground, slightly cratering it, he thrust his palm forward into Smoker's gut while rotating it with great power. Yashi Tsuyoku Dadi said as Smoker was launched backwards into the next building. Letting out a breath, Luffy stood straight and began running to the docks when a powerful presence crashed down in front of him, causing his eyes to widen. Sliding to a stop, Luffy had his fists clenched at his sides and hardened them with HAKI again, ready to fight. You little brat, what do you think you're doing, causing all of this trouble? A deep voice grumbled from the kicked-up dust cloud. Gramps, why the hell are you here? Luffy asked with a glare. I'm going to stop you from leaving this island, brat. Garp exclaimed, glaring at his grandson. Luffy was going to dash at his grandpa when he felt a vibrating on his chest from his vest. Reaching in, he grabbed his mini transponder snail and answered, receiving the sound of wind, rain and thunder on the other side. Luffy? Where the hell are you? We need to get out of here. Nami's voice shouted from the snail with a worried tone. Ran into Garp, you're going to have to go on ahead, I'll catch up to you. Luffy said with a serious tone. You ran into Garp, Nami shouted in shock, only to be cut off as Luffy hung up the snail and put it back in his vest. So that was your crew? Garp asked. Yeah. Luffy answered shortly, the tension thickening. The downpour continued as the Garp and Luffy stared each other down with narrowed eyes. Luffy launched forward in a rapid blur with his fist cocked back, Garp lashed out with his own fist, only to have Luffy kick the air and jump above him. Luffy threw his fist forward with a cry of, "Kick Hie Ken!" Garp intercepted Luffy's fist with his own, eliciting a grand shock wave that cratered the ground below them and shattered the rock, kicking up a large dust cloud that was cleared by Luffy being thrown back by one of Garp's punches. Luffy coughed up blood from the hit as he crashed into a building, causing it to collapse on top of him. If you want to sail to the Grand Line, you will have to get through me, brat. Garp shouted with a fierce glare. Grabbing his two swords, he swung out, causing a whirlwind of air blades to launch out and slice the surrounding rubble into small harmless pieces that fell to the ground and cleared a path for him. Glaring across at Garp, Luffy dashed at him with his swords at the ready. I don't care if you're my grandpa, but I will set sail for the Grand Line and become the Pirate King. Luffy shouted. Then show me the power of your will. Monkey D. Luffy. Garp shouted, his fists turning black with HAKI. Notoryu. Luffy said as he brought his swords up to an angle. Kamisori FK. He finished as he dashed past Garp with wide eyes. He let me hit him. Luffy thought in shock as he heard his grandpa collapse behind him. Standing up straight, he sheathed his swords and released a deep breath. I'll see you later, grandpa. He said as he sprinted to the ocean. After a few minutes of running, he saw that the Going Merry was in the distance, but not too far away. Stepping onto the ocean, he froze it with every step he took. Sorry. Luffy said as he dashed ahead at blinding speeds, a thin trail of ice right behind him that crumbled as more was created. After a few stop and goes of dashing across the ocean, Luffy arrived at the ship and jumped onto the deck with silent grace. He sensed that his crew was in the kitchen and made a mental note that the lighthouse light had just gone out and walked into the kitchen. When he opened the door, he was met with the relieved voices of his crew. So you managed to get away from Garp? Zoro questioned. Yeah, wasn't easy, but I managed. Luffy answered, wiping some blood off of his chin. Was he really that strong? Nami questioned worriedly, noticing how his hand was on his torso as if it was in pain. Yeah, the most he did was break a rib or two, though. I'll be fine, so you don't need to worry. Luffy said, noticing Kaya's worried glance. Anyway, we were discussing how we're supposed to enter the Grand Line. Nami said, looking at a map she held in her hands. There's two ways to get in the Grand Line, the mountain or the calm belt. He said with a flat tone and walking to the fridge to get some sake. Are you serious? Usopp exclaimed in shock. Ayup. Luffy said, popping the pea. Both ways are dangerous, but the calm belt is a lot more dangerous, so the safest is reverse mountain. Luffy explained as he found a bottle of sake and walked to the table. You're not serious, are you? Usopp asked with a shocked expression. Of course I am, and I'm pretty sure that Jin knows as well. Seeing as he's been there once. Luffy said, motioning to Jin who nodded. What's your point here? Nami asked with a small frown. My point is, listen to me and safely get through the Grand Line. Luffy ordered with a stern tone before he blinked in confusion. Wasn't it just raining outside? His eyes widened in fear. Shit. Go get the oars, we gotta get out of here. Luffy shouted, standing and running out to the deck. I was right. What? Why? Nejico asked in confusion. We just drifted into the calm belt and we need to get out of here. So get the oars. Luffy ordered with a loud voice. But why would we leave it so calm? Usopp said. I already told you it's the most dangerous way to get to the Grand Line, plus it's Luffy said before the ship started to quake. What the hell is this? Johnny exclaimed as he stumbled around. The seaquake, Alvida asked back. No, you idiots. Luffy shouted as the ship started to rise rapidly. When the ship stopped rising, the crew realized why the ship rose so high. They were on a sea king that was in the middle of a large group of other sea kings. And they were gargantuan. The Going Merry was a little smaller than just one of its teeth, showing how puny they were in comparison. The calm belt is a breeding ground for all of the sea kings, especially the large ones. Luffy muttered with a bead of sweat on his brow. I guess I'll just have to take care of at least one of them. Luffy said with a frown as he walked to the edge of the ship. What does he mean? Alvida asked Nami with a curious tone. You'll see soon enough. Nami said, motioning to Luffy who had drawn his swords. Right, prepare the oars, we're rowing away as soon as he splashed down, understood? Luffy asked with a serious tone, turning around to his crew while standing on the railing. Aye, Captain. Zoro said with a smirk, placing an oar at the railing. Affirmative. Usopp said with shaky legs, gripping onto the opposite oar. Good. Luffy said, leaning back in a freefall, feeling the air rush around him. Flipping and righting himself, Luffy faced the neck of the sea king that the ship was on and brought his swords to the opposite shoulders. Notorious, what's he doing? Alvida asked curiously. He's showing why he's the captain. Usopp said with a smirk after he was able to stop his legs from shaking. Looking down and over the railing, Alvida saw Luffy's eyes were narrowed in concentration. Just how strong is he? Alvida thought curiously before a smile grew on her face. He's definitely worthy of being my man. She thought. Luffy threw his arms out, slicing the air in front of him. Naraku Binkatsu, he said, falling for a moment then kicking the air below him to stay afloat. A deep red line grew across the Sea King's neck and spewed blood as its head slid off of its neck and crashed into the ocean with a large splash, leaving the Going Merry suspended in midair for a half second before plummeting to the ocean. Luffy sheathed his swords and dashed over to the Going Merry, using a combo of Zoro and Geppo, making it appear that small explosions were peppering the sky accompanied by a blur dashing between each of them. Heading up under the ship, Luffy put his hands on the hull and started to kick the air below him rapidly, his legs blurring with speed and power, the air exploding from the speed of Luffy's kicks. His legs began to burn from the strain he was putting on them to save the ship from shattering. He puffed out air and greedily inhaled oxygen that filled his lungs and helped him further. Slowly, the Going Merry began to slow in its rapid descent to the point that it was almost hovering until Luffy got out from under it and jumped up and onto the deck, collapsing as soon as he landed. Luffy, you alright? Zoro asked as he rode with Jin, Johnny, Yasaku and Alvida. Yeah, just exhausted. Luffy said as he panted and his legs ached. So, how long until we get out of the calm belt? Luffy asked, directing the question to Nami. About 5 minutes or so. Nami said, grunting with exertion as she rode with Nejico, Usopp, Sanji and Kaya. Good. Sooner we're out of here, sooner we get to paradise. Luffy said as managed to gradually get his breath back and stand on his painfully sore legs. 5 minutes later, alright, we're almost to Reverse Mountain. Luffy exclaimed with a grin. They were back into the stormy waters of the East Blue near Reverse Mountain, looking at the large red earthen wall before them that broke through the black thunderheads above them. Since this moment is so important, why don't we do something to commemorate it? Sanji said, carrying a barrel on his shoulder with a smile on his face. Sanji placed the barrel on the ground and placed his foot on top. To find the all blue. He said with a smirk. Placing his foot on the barrel as well, Luffy smirked. To become the Pirate King. Zoro followed suit. To become the world's greatest swordsman. Nami. To draw a map of the world. Usopp. To become a great warrior of the seas. Johnny and Yasaku. To be the best swordsman duo. Jin. To see the end of the world. Kaya. To become a world-renowned doctor. Nejico. To see the world map for myself. Alvida. To become the most beautiful woman in the world. Now then, Luffy said, raising his leg with everyone else following suit, off to the Grand Line. They all shouted, crashing their feet down and breaking the barrel, water splashing out from the remains. And so, they began sailing to Reverse Mountain, the entrance to the Grand Line. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.